Welcome back to our catechism class. Again, this is a introduction or a basic course. So we're going to go through the 6 main parts of Luther's small catechism to teach us a summary of Christian teachings. The first lesson then is there a God? Is God real? Well, yes, and you probably can answer the question because that's why you're taking part in this class, or at least you are assuming or hoping that he's real. We can actually determine that there has to be something bigger than us out there. We can determine this from nature. For example, if you were to go outside and observe nature, look at the different types of creatures that we have, look at the different types of plants that we have, spend a night on a cloudless night looking up at the stars and marvel at just how much there is. In addition, you can marvel at the complexity. Go to your local library and check out some books on like animal anatomy and look at all the different types of pictures and graphs and diagrams you have there. Check out a telescope if you can. And again, just take a deep look at the stars above. It's pretty fascinating. There is a lot going on in this created world. In addition, we notice that there's an order, that there's a structure to this. Just check out your own body. We have these digits, our fingers, our hands. We're able to grip things, and you can take a close look at your eyeballs in the mirror, and somehow this whole thing, even though I might trip over my feet, it all works together, and things happen without even conscious thought. I'm breathing without me thinking, oh, time to breathe, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. There is an orderliness, there's a complexity, there is structure that we can observe from nature, which implies that this doesn't just happen by chance. It's not one happy series of mistakes. Something had to plan this. In addition, we can determine that there has to be something bigger when we look at our own hearts, our conscience. Conscience, the short way of describing this would be that little voice that helps you determine right and wrong. An example, your mom bakes some delicious cookies. They're hard on the outside, but the middles are still squishy, and when you break them apart, you can see the gooey chocolate chips melting between them. Just perfect. And she says, please don't eat any of these until after supper. And then she walks out of the house to go run some errands, and they're sitting there cooling off. And you really want one. Oh, there's a lot. Maybe I rearrange them and take one. She won't even notice that one's missing. But there's that little twinge in your heart that tells you, don't do it. You know this is wrong. Even the fact that you're thinking of how can I get away with this tells us we know it's not the right thing to do. Well, where did that conscience come from? Where did that set of morals, morality, things that are right and wrong, I should do or I shouldn't do this, where does that come from? You could say, well, it comes from society, but where does society get it? It has to come from somewhere else. Really, I would say it has to be installed in us, again, from something bigger than us. We would call all of this the natural knowledge of God. So even before we get to the Bible, and yes, I know there are Bible passages up here, but even before we open up the Bible, just from nature, the natural world around us, from observing the whole world, and even observing our own conscience, we can tell logically something put all of this in place. There has to be something bigger than me that started all of this. And the Bible even talks about this as well. From Hebrews chapter 3 in the New Testament, it says, for every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. If you play Legos, then you understand the picture here. They have the little Lego instruction books and it tells you how to build a very complex building. And we love doing that at our house. But you're not just going to like put the Legos in a big bin and just start shaking them up and hope something good comes out. No, there's a plan involved, and you have to put it together. You look at this world, and you say, well, every house is built by someone. You can look at the world around you, the houses even, and some architect planned that, some construction workers put it together. Work went into that. It didn't just happen. In the same way, The whole universe. Work went into this. It didn't just happen. God made this. He is the builder of everything. Romans chapter 1, again in the New Testament. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. There's no excuse for pretending that God doesn't exist. We can see his invisible qualities. We don't necessarily see him, but we can see, I can see his eternal power. Something had to have the power to make all this, and a divine nature. It has to be something different than us, that goes beyond us, something bigger than us, something before us. I can tell, again, logically, that something bigger put all of this together. I'm going to go back to the Old Testament now then. Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. You mentioned before, just look up into the night sky. Look at all the stars. You can even get out your old constellation charts, and it's amazing. You can't look at that and say, well, this just is one big happy accident. It almost seems absurd. Um, there's just too much going on. There's an orderliness. You can even open up your science books, which is good, and read all about uh, how everything works together, these different forces that are working together, and it's really fascinating. In addition, finally, Psalm 14, verse 1, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool here, not an unintelligent person, but the word fool means the person who refuses to recognize that has to be a God. So the fool says in his heart, there is no God, when just from the natural knowledge, looking at the world around us, we have to determine that there has to be something bigger. A couple more verses for you. Romans chapter 2. Indeed, when Gentiles, so Gentiles would be the non-Jewish people, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. Quick pause there. So the Apostle Paul is writing the book of Romans to Roman Christians, and he's reminding them that people who did not grow up with like the Ten Commandments, who did not grow up with God's word, somehow without God's word, they still recognize, for example, that murder is wrong, that you shouldn't steal, that lying is bad. Well, how do they know that? Well, from what's in their heart. They do by nature these things that are actually required by God's law, really that they're a law for themselves. They show that they have the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. I'm going to go back to the cookie story. Your conscience, your thoughts accusing you, don't do this, or even defending you. I did not take a cookie before dinner, so that was the right thing to do. Good for me. We know that outside of the Bible to a certain extent. So from that, we can tell there has to be, again, someone that put that in there in our hearts. 1 John chapter 1 also testifies to this. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Here's one of those key words, sin. So sin would be going against the law, whether it's written in our hearts or the law that we read in God's word, going against God's design. If we claim to be without sin, I've never done anything wrong. I've never gone against how we've been designed. Well, we deceive ourselves. The truth is not in us. Even if you don't have the Bible, if you don't know the Bible, the world over, people recognize when they do something wrong. We have that conscience, and we don't need to deceive ourselves and say, this isn't bad. We can tell this was not a right thing to do. Summarize all of this then. Nature tells us something created all of this. Conscience tells us this something has rules for living. The natural knowledge of God logically leads to two outcomes. Because my conscience tells me that I've gone against these rules, and nature tells me that there is something out there who has put these rules in place, I'm either going to be terrified of this something because I don't really know all that much about it. I'm going to try and make it up to him, or I'm going to try to ignore him because I recognize that I have not listened to my conscience. If I just pretend he's not there, I'm feeling pretty good. Or if you recognize that if there's something out there, I'm going to try and get right with this bigger thing than me. Nature and conscience tells us that there has to be a God, but it does not tell us exactly who this God is. God has to reveal himself to us, and he does this with the Bible. For next time, then, I want you to be able to define what is meant by the phrase natural knowledge of God. It's the knowledge we have of a God from nature. And that's a pretty simple definition. So, what is the natural knowledge of God? It's the knowledge we have that there has to be something bigger, and we have this from nature and from our conscience. Also, be able to answer what the natural knowledge of God can tell us. There is something bigger, and he has power, and he's orderly. There are rules. But what it cannot tell us as well is that who he is and how he feels toward us. He reveals that for us with his word. We'll go into the Bible next time. Thanks again for tuning in, and God's blessings.